We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill. Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for? Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And this week we have in studio Tyler O'Neill, and he's managing editor of the Daily Signal, which is a project of the Heritage Foundation, a kind of a news magazine, news and opinion online site. But he also is an author. He wrote a book several years ago called Making Hate Pay on the Southern Poverty Law Center, which the Center for Immigration Studies has had some interactions with. And he has a new book coming out at the beginning of next year called The Woketopus, like an octopus, a woke octopus. The Woketopus, the dark money cabal manipulating the federal government. And it deals with a variety of policy areas that the center has nothing to do with, but he does have a chapter on immigration. And I thought it would be good to have him come in and sort of give us a little look at what he's found on the immigration issue. Basically, it's really sort of where is the money behind the high immigration side is kind of really what it's about. And book's obviously available for pre-order. We'll have a link and what have you in the show notes. But Tyler, thanks for coming in. And if you could just sort of give us the origin story of the book and then talk specifically about the immigration parts of it.
Yeah, no, I'd be glad to. Thanks so much for having me. I should note real quick that the Daily Signal is no longer officially part of Heritage.
Oh, okay. So
we are its own,
off.
Yes,
okay.
our own independent organization.
Good.
That said, we're still, friendly, close with Heritage and everything.
Right.
So yeah, this book started actually from my previous book. I had realized that the Southern Poverty Law Center, despite having no credibility at all, is repeatedly cited by many organizations, particularly in the legacy media, the government, Democrats, the left in general, using the SPLC to demonize conservatives, Christians, and many mainstream people as hate groups, comparing them to the Ku Klux Klan, putting them on the hate map that the SPLC developed to monitor the Klan. And I realized during the Biden administration that the SPLC has its tentacles across the federal government. And I started wondering what other organizations have also been infiltrating the federal government. And if an organization that is as bad as the Southern Poverty Law Center has been able to be brought into the White House, into the Department of Education, into the DOJ, and cited by the FBI in going after radical traditional Catholics, what other far-left organizations have been also infiltrating the administrative state? And once you start digging on something like this, you just keep finding one after another after another.
Interesting. And so is this just, you're talking about more than just personnel, right? In other words, you're talking about access and what have you. So what do you mean by their tentacles? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the Woketopus is a vast influence apparatus that is backed up by the left's dark money network. People like, George Soros, who's no longer running Open Society Foundations, is his son, Alex Soros, but also the network of nonprofits that were started by the for-profit organization Arabella Advisors.
Is that Tides or is that a different thing?
No, Tides is also on the list.
Okay.
Yes, Tides, the Tides Foundation, Proteus, many of these left-wing pass-through organizations where they work with big donors to cloak who's giving money to whom. And so they are propping up many different activist organizations that are staffing, influencing, sending memos to the administrative state, getting their policies, preferred policies, through. And all of these organizations are woke. And I define woke as, being in favor of critical race theory, of transgender, gender ideology, climate alarmism, and a preference for technocratic government. government.
Right.
And I think that last one really encompasses a lot. One of the worst examples that was clearest was when, I don't know if you've heard of this organization called Demos, but they crafted an executive order that Biden essentially, copy pasted. And it was all about turning federal government agencies into voter registration arms.
Interesting.
That would help register likely Democratic voters
Mm-hmm.
who were reliant on the federal government for benefits.
Interesting.
And so in that case, not only did Biden essentially, let Demos write the executive order, he also had a listening session with Demos and a lot of other organizations in my book, and nobody on the conservative, nobody on the election integrity side of the issue, all with this, left-wing voter suppression angle, those sorts of people.
Right.
Came to this thing. And then multiple agencies, one after another, worked with Demos to implement the executive order. So it was as if the Biden administration said, hey, Demos, we're deputizing you to create our policy.
Right. Interesting.
And we've seen similar situations over and over again. The biggest one on immigration is that there were 3 organizations that were tied in that are part of this woke apparatus that influenced the beginning of DHS at the beginning of the Biden administration. So when you have the transition period,
Right.
you had the Center for American Progress, the American Civil Liberties Union, and America's Voice.
Mm-hmm.
And they all had major people who were tapped either for the transition team for DHS or to lead and influence DHS. And you get this very interesting, the Center for American Progress had a document where they said, this is what the administration, what DHS should do. This is what the new administration should do.
Right.
And one of the main things they said was that you need to treat immigration as an asset to be managed, not as a crime to be enforced.
Right. Interesting. I want to get back to more specifics about the immigration part of this. Like, where there's money involved, there's money sloshing around a lot of these groups, federal money. But the first thing that some people are going to ask is, well, how is this different from groups that oppose them that do the same kind of thing? In other words, CIS is a think tank, but we still, obviously we want to have an influence on the government. And in fact, 2 months from when we post this, probably at least a few of our staff members will be in government positions. Heritage obviously had, always has a attempt to kind of lay out policy alternatives that it prefers. How is that different from what you're talking about in the book?
Yeah, well, so what I'm talking about in the book is a long-running campaign. What you have on the left, you have this confluence of the way that the administrative state thinks
Mm-hmm.
and the worldview that the left has. And so that means there's a natural fit there that isn't true with the right. And also, one of the main issues I talk about in the book is the labor issue.
Mm-hmm.
Big labor unions that not only fund Democrats, but also fund many of these activist groups when they report their donations to charity.
Right.
They're really going to prop up these left-wing causes. And you have this, back scratching that goes back and forth between these organizations and the federal government. And the federal bureaucracy leans in this direction anyway.
I see.
And so there's more corruption here. There's also more of an influence from the left's dark money apparatus. It's bigger than the right's. And that's one of the things that, people like Sheldon Whitehouse need to take a look at, see like, wait, if you oppose all of the dark money, why are you not looking at George Soros? Why are you not looking at the Tides Foundation or Arabella?
Right.
But I think the number one thing, and this is something I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Times in the past week about, is that this is kind of like the left's Project 2025.
Interesting.
But if
Right.
it had already existed decades ago, and if it was, set into the entire system. So I don't have a problem with organizations releasing documents, having policies to direct the federal government one way or the other. I think in a free society, we should be healthy. It is healthy to influence our elected officials to some degree.
Right.
What I have a problem with is the content often of the policies. that the Woketopus is pushing.
Mhm.
And this idea that the bureaucrats know better than the American people, and you cannot dissent from this ideology. So
Interesting.
when it comes to critical race theory, when it comes to transgender ideology, when it comes to
Open
climate
borders
alarmism,
even. Yeah, right.
yeah, if you disagree, you're a heretic and you need to be excised from polite society. And if you get really bad, if you're a pro LGBT group that doesn't like the latest trans fads like gays against groomers, then you got to be put on the hate map
Right.
with the Klan. So I think the left has a lot bigger of an influence apparatus and a defamation apparatus with the SPLC that the right doesn't have. And that's partially because the left is in control of a lot of the institutions
Right.
that really need reform.
Right. Interesting. So on the immigration thing, one of the sort of phrases or kind of rubrics you used in your immigration chapter in the book, the immigration industrial complex.
Yes.
Basically the money sloshing around, federal money to private groups, et cetera. What's sort of kind of the short version of what does that mean? What's it involve?
Yeah. So the chapter focuses on two aspects. First, there are the woke organizations that push the Biden administration to have an open borders policy. Second, there are all of these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are receiving hefty government grants for the housing and transportation of illegal aliens across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a massive scandal that hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves, because essentially we have the federal government, in some cases, actually flying illegal aliens into the United States, despite the fact that Congress has never authorized programs like the CHNV program,
Mm-hmm.
et cetera. But you also have these NGOs that, if you look at their books, a lot of them wouldn't exist without federal funding.
Right.
And the federal grants they receive dwarf anything else that they're getting from private donations. And yet these organizations are taking illegal aliens, busing them to different parts of the country. And, we at the Heritage Foundation's Oversight Project found they traced the cell phones of these people.
Right. I remember that.
And
Yeah.
they found that 434 of America's 435 congressional districts have had illegal aliens transported to those districts. So in other words, this is, if you want to have, and I think, we're talking as the second Trump administration is ramping up. If you want to have a massive deportation of all these illegal aliens, which I think is just, I think it's, legal. I think it's going to be interesting to see how the left fights back as Trump tries to pull this out. But I also think that Americans want mass deportation at this point, but these organizations have made it so that mass deportation is going to be really difficult
Mm-hmm.
because you have to go throughout the entire country and find people. And I mean, hopefully you had a great column, I think it was, talking about self-deportation and the importance of, if the administration says, if you're an illegal alien, you should get out of the country, we're going to get you out. It would behoove you to leave on your own and on your own terms.
Right.
I think that that's an effective and important message. And I think hopefully more of the illegals will listen to that. Unfortunately, I think one of the worst parts of this whole crisis is that many of the illegals don't realize they're illegals.
Right.
And the way that the Biden administration has gaslit the American people and gaslit the people that they're claiming to help, but actually are harming. Like these people
kind of gaslit the illegal aliens themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, interesting.
No, and
I never
it's
thought
funny
of that.
because like the illegal aliens, they are themselves to some degree a victim of this. But that doesn't mean that they belong here. And I think the number one aspect of immigration that, I grew up in Colorado. I had legal Mexican immigrants in my class with me
Mhm.
who went through the process. So I know, secondhand what it's like to go through the legal immigration process. It's complicated. It's onerous.
Mhm.
And I think most Americans realize it would be nice to make it a little bit easier for those who are coming legally. But at the same time, we have this tremendous amount of people who have completely circumvented the legal pathway and completely acted as though, and it is a tremendous insult to every one of those legal immigrants who comes to this country, who honors our laws, who, they are excellent Americans, in my opinion. And I think we need to learn from them. But at the same time, they're the ones who are being most insulted when we open our borders and allow all of these illegals to skip the line. And that is patently unjust. And the idea that people are not fed up with this system, like Trump won for a reason. I think this is one of the main reasons he did.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it is an interesting point because the estimates are, 2 million or so illegal immigrants under Biden came in as they call so-called gotaways. In other words, they knew they were sneaking over. That's partly also Biden's fault because the Border Patrol was busy buying, baby formula for all the families that turned themselves in. But the large majority of illegal immigrants that have come here under Biden were essentially let in by the administration. They came and turned themselves in. They're illegal aliens. They crossed illegally. There's no dispute about that. But they did it because they were essentially invited to do so and then let go. And then others, like you mentioned, a smaller but still very large number, came in with these various illegal parole programs. But if you're the person getting parole, it's like, I don't know, this is a government paper. It seems, in other words, it looks legal to you.
Yeah.
And the way I've put it for the CBP-1 program at the border, not the flights one, but the one that anybody can take if they come to a port of entry.
Take the CBP-1 app. Yeah. You see
and
the
you
ads.
you're scheduling your illegal entry, basically. But what the federal government has said, in effect, is to these people, don't break the law by illegally crossing the border. We'll break it for you by illegally letting you in. And so this is no reason to let any of these people stay. They still aren't allowed here. But the buck stops with the president. This is his and obviously Mayorkas's doing. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the point is people are making a lot of money off of this. And the interesting thing is you specifically, I don't know if in the chapter itself you went into more specifics, but in the excerpts that I've seen, you're talking about Catholic Charities and what used to be Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services. I didn't know they changed their names. HIAS also.
Yeah.
Religious groups. HIAS is Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. So you got Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish organizations, and there's others on top of that. They got their start in this immigration industrial complex lawfully, as it were, through refugee resettlement. In other words, the State Department, in effect, has created this network of NGOs, which then, under Biden, as you describe here, has kind of metastasized into a driver of illegal immigration rather than just facilitating refugee resettlement, which, whether it's good or bad, you like it or not, is authorized by the law. But that was kind of the starting point. And then what you've described here is how these groups have kind of run with that to go beyond the scope of what they originally were doing.
Yeah, I can't pinpoint exactly when that transition took place. But yeah, this industrial complex has really revved up into super high gear in the past few years. And to the degree, and I have a part of the book where I talk about Catholic social teaching, because I'm not Catholic, but I almost became Catholic, and I'm very, very friendly with my friends across the Tiber. But I think it's important. There are a lot of people who claim that Catholic social teaching requires us to have all these immigrants, to not close borders. And it's like, no,
we've
Catholic social teaching is very complicated.
Yeah.
Right. And there's good reason, like governments have just purposes. And one of those is to maintain the integrity of a country. And so that's Catholic social teaching, but there's also a lot of Protestant, Christian, even, Islamic and Jewish thought backing up the idea that a country has an inherent ability to protect itself from invasion. Right. And I don't like calling it invasion, but to some degree that is, it's an invited invasion where, and it's not like these people are organized in an army, but it clearly seems the Biden administration intentionally, and not just the Biden administration, everybody who's involved in this complex,
Right.
is intentionally and happily welcoming in millions of people into this country to change the makeup of the country. I mean, that has to be, and I don't think it has anything to do with race. I think it has to do with them trying to import an underclass that's going to be grateful to a certain
basically.
right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right.
It's going to be grateful to a certain party, and then they're always going to support that party. That's
Right.
the thinking. I don't think that thinking necessarily bears out. And one of the weird aspects of this is that I think it's a bigger, Americans realize they're being had.
Right.
And I don't think even all of the immigrants, even the illegal immigrants, favor a policy like this, because I was listening to a really excellent podcast earlier last night, and I think it was Peter Thiel talking with Barry Weiss, and he was saying that what we often see is that new immigrants oppose further immigration.
Sure.
Because when you're coming into a city and you're new, you're starting to get your foot. And then once you get your foot in the door, more people is bad for you.
Right.
And so your rents continue to increase. And often what happens when you have a big population boom is that the rents outpace the price of most everything else. And one of the main drivers of inflation that's killing Americans right now is this housing deficit that we have,
Right.
partially because we have this influx of illegal aliens.
And that's something that Australia and Canada actually really kind of started to realize, Britain as well, before it really dawned on us here, I think. But the libertarian answer often is, well, then we'll just build more housing. It's like, okay, well,
you should,
yeah,
but
that's
there's
fine.
no zoning.
That's
but
fine. Yeah, how does that
zoning
happen?
exists?
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's zoning, and there's just practical, limits on how fast things could get done anyway. So the more I think about it, this immigration industrial complex, it did get started with refugee resettlement, and the groups you're talking about, the religion-related groups, church groups, they did start that way. But, I think one of the kind of milestones in this is the growth of this unaccompanied minor phenomenon, because Congress changed the law such that unaccompanied minors, and what that even means is kind of contested.
Yeah.
If they're not from Mexico or Canada, are not sent back, they're automatically given to Health and Human Services, and then they're given to sponsors and all that. And that, I think, was like step 2 after refugee resettlement, where a lot of these groups started making big money off of federal grants. And then it kind of just blew up under Biden. So this is something that's been building for a while. What if there's a Woketopus, as it were, at least, and the other areas we don't deal with any transgender or whatever, any of that stuff. I mean, personally, I have strong opinions on it, but we've got, there's a lot of people who have different opinions who are still critical of immigration. How do we starve the beast, basically? I mean, what do we do about the Woketopus?
Yeah, there are a lot of things we can do. One of the biggest is when you're voting, and I think we had this to some degree in the 2024 election. When you're voting, you need to look at not just the people who are at the top of the ticket, but the people who would be joining them in an administration. Mm-hmm. And it's very important.
Let me be clear here, the Center for Immigration Studies does not get involved in elections in any way. But,
exactly.
But the insight is relevant regardless of the issue or the candidate, quite frankly.
Right. Well, and that's what I write. I'm an employee of a 501c3 too. I'm not making any endorsements or attacks. I'm just saying that is part of what we can do. Well, we can also
so you're not just voting for one guy. You're voting for everything behind and with him and all of that.
Precisely.
Interesting. Yeah.
And another thing we can do is pay attention to where our money is going. I found if you're a donor and you have money through certain donor advised funds, the Woketopus is trying to make it so that you can't give money to certain causes, and so that you will almost automatically give money to the left's preferred causes.
Interesting.
And so what you try sometimes to look at, I would say, look at the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map, find an organization on there that you agree with. I mean, Center for Immigration Studies is a good one. Alliance Defending Freedom is another very mainstream one I always talk about.
Right.
Try to give to that organization through your donor advised fund. And if they say no, raise hell.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because
it's sort of a test, basically, of the fund.
Exactly.
These are things like Vanguard has one, Fidelity has one, Donors Trust. There's a lot of community foundations that are the same kind of thing. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So it's funny to think about, but there's a vast charitable industry almost that exists where, and most Americans, I think, don't fully understand how big this is or how involved they themselves already are in this. Another aspect, though, is if you are a union member. And I think one of the main things to talk about is if you're a union member, especially if you're one of I focus only on the top 3 unions and the teachers union. So the AFCME, the AFL-CIO, the SEIU, the American Federation for Teachers, and the NEA, the National Education Association. These groups take money that they get from union dues and they give it to woke organizations that are impacting federal policy. And they do so by saying that these are charitable donations. And I think what you need to do is say, if you're a member of any of these unions, ask if you can opt out of having your dues be sent to this sort of thing. Like, just make it known, because what we have is the Woketopus is a massive enterprise that is connected in ways that we wouldn't think of to this influence campaign. The other thing to do, and I mean, obviously buy the book. That's always I should have started with that one.
And you can pre-order the book on Amazon. We'll have a link in the show notes.
But, with this information, and there are all sorts of ways, I'm sure, that you can have an impact. Don't assume that just because you're a normal American, you can't stop this. Because I think, in the age of social media, raising a stink online actually can resonate.
Sure.
Trying to go to local leaders and saying, look at this. Also, I think one of the big things is to notice how vast the left's dark money apparatus is. George Soros, or I think it was the Open Society Foundation, but they bought a whole bunch of radio stations across the country recently. Yeah. And, the influence of these donors and these groups is very widespread. And just knowing what organizations to look out for, and then going to your employer, to community groups, to your friends and neighbors, like, you can have a lot more of an impact than you think.
Now, what you're talking about here is the private money, or ostensibly private money, dark money that goes into these things. There's also a huge amount of government money that's directed through contracts, and often no bid contracts and what have you. Any sort of just ideas, or even a handful of numbers throughout, what kind of volume are we talking about of taxpayer money going to some of these organizations?
Yeah. So I have some of the numbers. Global Refuge, the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, received $180 million in government grants. And that was more than 7 times what it received in all other contributions.
Wow.
Which is $25 million in 1 year. And the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants reported receiving $117.4 million through government grants in 2020. And that was, that's the vast, vast majority of its $121 million. Only $3 more million did it get through non-government grants.
We've done some of this, again, strictly looking at the refugee resettlement groups, what they used to call VOLAGs, voluntary organizations. They came up with another word for it, but they're just State Department contractors. And, you want to do well while doing good. There's this idea, well, they're doing pretty darn well, whatever it is they think they're doing.
Yeah. No, they really are. And the fact that they're making all this money, I mean, I don't like to question people's motives because I think many of the people who get involved in these things probably did have good motives at the start. But if you're making all this money in these government contracts and you're moving illegal aliens across the country and you're not making sure that they're legal, you really need to do some soul searching because you're part of the apparatus that's destroying this country.
Right. The way I look at it is, only really sociopaths do things that they believe to be wrong because they're getting paid for them. In other words,
right.
Whether their motivations are good or bad, they think their motivations are good. In other words, they think they're doing the right thing. It's just that's kind of the question, and you're a whole lot less likely to question what you're doing if your paycheck depends on it. I mean, some people do, obviously, but it's a hard thing to do for people. So in a sense, that's why you need outside transparency and oversight to make sure that, because, in a sense, it's sort of who guards the guardians. Well, who oversees the activist groups, in a sense?
Yeah. Well, and I'm trying to do just that.
Right. So you said the book grew out of the SPLC book that you had written, and we'll have a link to that too. What got you started on writing that original book several years ago?
Yeah. So that one came out in 2020. Making Hate Pay, The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center, came from, I had been covering the Southern Poverty Law Center for a little while, and I remembered when the shooter at FRC had targeted the Family Research Council, here in D.C., had come in with a bag of Chick-fil-A chicken sandwiches and a semi-automatic pistol and opened fire and tried to kill everyone in the building. He later told the FBI that was his goal. Luckily, the building manager, a brave man by the name of Leo Johnson, stopped it, suffered a grievous wound in the process. I think I first really covered the story in 2014 when the terrorist pleaded guilty to terrorism charges and got a 25-year sentence. And then Leo Johnson very publicly in court forgave him. And I thought that was really remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
And then later I saw in Charlottesville, when you had the white nationalists marching in Charlottesville, that the Southern Poverty Law Center suddenly became the legacy media's number one source on hate.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw CNN just post the hate map and say, this is the resource. And you had all these different people. And at the time, the SPLC was facing a budding defamation lawsuit from Liberty Counsel because GuideStar had put SPLC markers on every group on their profiles
done it to us too,
for these nonprofits. They must have done it to you, to Alliance Defending Freedom, to everybody. And so Liberty Counsel filed a lawsuit, and I saw that and I was like, this is a really important story. I have to tell it. I wrote a quick story on it, and it got picked up by the Drudge Report.
I see.
And then I wrote about another lawsuit that was filed against the SPLC, and that got picked up by the Drudge Report. And I realized that there was a big need for someone to push back on the SPLC's lies.
I see, yeah.
And that it seemed like I was well positioned to do that. And so in 2019, they had this massive scandal where the co-founder, Morris Dees, got fired amid accusations of racial discrimination and sexual harassment. They brought in Tina Chen, Michelle Obama's former chief of staff, as the fixer. They promised an internal review, and no review was ever published. And then, a month after all this happened, you had the interim president, Karen Baines Dunning, coming out and comparing the SPLC to the Underground Railroad. And so I'm just like, okay, how does anyone take this organization seriously?
Right.
And I thought there have been few things, like I'd always kind of wanted to write a book, but there have been few things that stuck in my craw quite like this. And I think at some point in 2019, there came a point where, come hell or high water, I was going to write a book about this. And unfortunately, I published it right before COVID hit.
Right.
So the big COVID sales slump of books
Right.
kind of destroyed my launch there.
Right.
But
But
I
you still did a kind of, I mean, it still serves as a kind of reference in the sense of bringing a lot of these things together. And then that grew into your current book or the upcoming one, the Woketopus. But the point is, if this money gets cut off, the federal money, it seems to me that doesn't doom this Woketopus, at least in the immigration area, but it seems like it would certainly weaken it. And there has been talk, in the kind of Trump orbit of starving, of turning this stuff off and starving some of these organizations. And in fact, in Trump 1, when they reduced refugee resettlement significantly, a lot of these groups did in fact have to retrench because they were Lutheran Immigrant Refugee Services, HIAS, all of them, their revenue stream was dramatically reduced. And that, I don't know if that chastened them, but their influence was at least significantly less.
Yeah. No, I think that is largely, so one of the things that whoever ends up at DHS really has to do, and I believe Trump is named.
Yeah, it's Kristi Noem.
Oh, yeah, it is Kristi Noem,
right.
yeah.
She's
So
overall anyway,
Kristi
and then there'll
Noem-
be within it, like who will be head of USCIS and what have you. We don't know yet.
The new administration really has to take the axe to these programs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say, we don't want, well, I mean, it is to say we don't believe that taxpayer money should be resettling illegal aliens throughout this country. It should be, it's a very basic thing. Like when your taxes are taken, I used to believe in this thing called the Hyde Amendment, where like if you don't support abortion, your tax dollars should not be sent to abortion.
Right.
Well, if you don't support importing illegal aliens and moving them all throughout the country, like, do you think that tax dollars should be forced? No, of course not.
Interesting, of course.
And so this is very basic common sense.
And even legal refugee resettlement, which is, like I said, it's separate in a sense from what you're talking about, but it really is, it forms kind of the core and the foundation of this whole network. Even there, it's been transformed from a kind of an act of charity on the part of people where you would be a sponsor and you would be financially responsible for, say, a family that, fled communist Czechoslovakia or something like that, into basically just a State Department, grant program where if you're a sponsor, and there are sponsors who do this, you're responsible for 3 months. That's it. And the 3 months, basically what you do is, okay, you get them set up, you get some used furniture at the Goodwill, help them sort of look for a job, and then sign them up for welfare and then move on to the next person.
Yeah.
And so this idea of actual charity kind of being perverted into this pseudo charity funded by tax money really is insidious. And that's not even considering what you're talking about here, which is tax money being used to settle people who are illegally here rather than refugee resettlement. But the concept, I think, one grows from the other.
Yeah.
Well, good. Thank you, Tyler O'Neill, author of the upcoming book, The Woketopus, The Dark Money Cabal Manipulating the Federal Government. It's about a variety of policy areas, but there's a whole chapter on the immigration issue. We're going to have a link for pre-ordering if you want. And Tyler is the managing editor of the Daily Signal, which is dailysignal.org. Is that the right address?
It's dailysignal.com.
.com, okay. And for sort of ongoing news and commentary on a variety of issues. So anyway, thanks for coming in, Tyler, and I hope you keep an eye on this.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Thanks again for having me. You can find the Daily Signal on all platforms. We're constantly pushing on YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, X, not TikTok. For some reason, we don't have any truck with the Chinese Communist Party. But you can also find me, Tyler, the numeral 2, O'Neill, O'Neil, with just one L.
At Twitter?
On X, Truth Social, yeah. X,
All
Twitter.
the usual places.
I still like Twitter. I mean,
it's spelled,
I love what Elon Musk has done, but
it's spelled X. It's pronounced Twitter. That's kind of the way I think of it.
Yes, I like that.
So anyway, thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
In the meantime, until next week, this is Mark Krikorian. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to, as always, to our producer, Brian Griffith. And if the podcast platform you get this on allows for rating or reviewing, please do that. There's a lot of podcasts out there, and anything that kind of raises the profile of our podcast is beneficial. And even if you can't do that, if you have any ideas, complaints, criticisms, compliments, whatever, even ideas for future shows, feel free to email us at center@cis.org. Until next week, thanks for tuning in.